So first up, we have a speaker, Josh Carlson. Josh Carlson is the author of Space Power Ascendant. This book contrasts Chinese and American space theory and strategy, and it finds that China will win if the current strategy is not changed. Josh holds a master's degree in English and in military operational arts and science, and is the editor at Space Force Journal. His book, Space Power Ascendant, it's been receiving great reviews. It's extremely timely and relevant as China just planted its flag on the moon this week, as Michael already talked about. Josh, are you here with us? Can we get a sound check?
I am. How are you guys doing?
Great. Welcome, Josh. Thank you. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Yes. So I'm going to be talking about space development theory primarily, and the infrastructure that must be with that. Space development theory looks at, ultimately, I think a lot of what Michael Mealing was just saying with how do you close the economic case? And so from my perspective, how do you get outside LEO and still make it economically viable? In my opinion, with the limited research I have done, it looks to me like to get away from that, we have to get away from the concept of either just exploration in space or just the data usage or data sharing that most of the LEO stuff looks at. So being able to broadcast various things. The only thing I think that would justify a lunar economic endeavor would be the things that are either very difficult or contested on Earth. In particular, the rare earth metals come to mind, as those are, well, rare, as their name would indicate. And China and Russia have been using the market in an effort to gather those resources and keep us from being able to use them as much as possible. And ultimately, the rare earth metals, obviously that determines, among other things, computing capabilities and some of the more extreme production capabilities that we would be looking at. And so, I mean, we spent trillions of dollars going to the Middle East, among other things, attempting to secure our flow of a very valuable resource, oil. It would make sense then that you would also make sure that you could secure vital resources like rare earth metals. That would be a part of the lunar expansion, and a very good reason to go there specifically, and not necessarily anywhere else. Additionally, the solar power and water ice in the form of ice present on the north and south pole of the moon. If you refine that, you can create propellant for rockets, and using reusable rockets, you can reduce the supply line costs of going to the moon. And so I would see the rare earth would be the driver, and then the water would be a benefit to be able to have, essentially to refuel your vehicles, so you're able to make it there quicker, and you are not having to bring all that fuel, get it out of Earth's gravity well. It's already there on the moon if you've got a base there. So all of that, let's get into the space development theory talk. Space development theory takes a step back, looks at space from the perspective of nationally, how can it be used? And it takes the cues primarily from the historical naval and land expansions as well that are fairly similar, and particularly look at the European expansion to the New World. You look at America's expansion across the Midwest during the 1800s. And you can break it down into several steps that seem like they repeat. It seems to be a consistent theme across all domains. In particular, it goes exploration, you have to see what's there. Expansion, you have to go there and reduce your cost of getting there and back. Exploitation, and that's really the touchstone, and exploitation is taking the resources, the positions, everything intrinsic to that area that you have just gone to, and bolstering national economic capability through that. And then the final stage is a situational stage. If claims are contested or there is a competitor, then you might enter a phase of exclusion, which is utilizing, among other things, the military tool of national power in an effort to secure your access to that area and exclude the enemy. One other element of space development theory, I'll come back and visit those later. I'm just prefacing in talking about all this. The other element of space development theory is recognizing a division in the domain in space that all other domains recognize. All other domains recognize the military and civilian delineation. You have the Army, obviously, and the civilian, or however you would refer to them. You have in Navy, you have sea power and maritime. And in air, you have air power and aviation. I've started to see in the recent space capstone document, there was a mention of military space power, which suggests, unless they're doing I believe a tautology, they're not restating the same thing. So they are trying to say that there is space power and then there is military space power. They are trying to make a distinction. I would propose the terms space power to delineate all things military, primarily militarily focused, and then astronautics as things that are primarily civilian, economic, industrial. This is basically everything else. The production capabilities, these would be astronautics. Both of these are defined as things that benefit the nation. They must be able to accomplish strategic ends for the nation. This is important because it helps you think about the difference, especially as there is a expansion in the markets that we're seeing that's fairly unprecedented. I mean, we're into the hundreds of billions of dollars internationally, but the government programs are only in the tens of billions. So there is a commercial market, as Mike Lane was talking about on the supply side, that for the first time we're really having to recognize as a independent. I think it should be recognized. I think we're still in the process of recognizing it as a independent force in the market. This helps make sense of commerce as it's something that must be independently supported, something that must be bolstered and protected by the military domain, very similar to the naval domain. Mahan and Corbett both talk about commerce as the driving force behind military sea power. The reason for a Navy's existence is ultimately to be able to protect the commerce that flows through the oceans. That commerce is it would be considered under the phrase exploitation. It is the economic bolstering of the nation. And so ultimately the core element that must be the case is the commerce, that the sea commerce must be protected because of that. The only reason that we have the Navy there is to protect it because other people might not like the Navy. There's pirates and all sorts of other unsavory characters. But the core of space development theory is recognizing that there is a difference between military capability, which is found under space power, and the economic, which is astronautics. Now, how do you use these? In the very first phase of space development theory, of the phases of space development, is exploration. The point of exploration, there's not a lot of infrastructure necessarily at that point. In the terrestrial domain, this would look like in the European expansion, saying the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, across the ocean. That is a exploration. We are going to see what is there. Another example of this would be Captain Cook's voyage, circa 1860, 50, by the British through the Pacific. Once again, seeing what's there, specifically cataloging the physical presence, the resources that are present, being able to catalog any key checkpoints or key strategic locations. Exploration isn't particularly heavy on the infrastructure, but it is very heavy on sending systems there, usually recovering them, people and systems, depending on what you're doing. Lewis and Clark through the Midwest, once again, another example of exploration. We bought this thing from France, and now we have to go figure out what's actually here. And how do we maneuver on it? What is the most efficient things? What is about the domain that is important? And exploration, one last one, just as an example, circa, I believe, about 1870. After the Civil War, the Navy was trying to find a purpose for itself. One thing it found is that it could bolster the effectiveness of the supply lines going across the Atlantic by documenting the currents, because traditionally they would just sail straight to Europe, assuming that the fastest or the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. But in reality, on the ocean, they found out that the currents actually pushed the ships, and they were able to make several weeks actually faster voyages, which obviously now lets them turn around, come back faster. They are able to make profit at significantly higher percentage than simply going straight and back, because they were able to travel faster. Examples, and in space, we've already done a fair amount of exploration. I would argue that we are probably in the next phase already in the orbits, and particularly Leo, we're into the expansion phase. On the moon, I think there's still some exploration obviously being done. I would categorize China's Chang'e 5 that just captured the rocks and brought back. That is definitely exploration. They are going there and seeing what is there. Assuming that, and then they are probably doing it based on the fact that the last one they sent, the last rover, had seeds, which suggests that they are looking at perhaps some sort of settlement on the moon, being able to possibly grow their own food or some other sort of crops. And so that would be, exploration is always with an eye for expansion. And so to transition, exploration, you're done with exploration when you have a good feeling of what is there, what the strategic locations are, and how to move effectively in the domain. Once you know what's there, know how to use it, and can move effectively in the domain, you begin with expansion. Expansion is the extending of national infrastructure, and this is where infrastructure becomes very important, into the domain to lower the risk of movement in the domain, lower the cost, the physical cost of moving in the domain, and ultimately making sure you have a secure supply line to protect strategic locations in the domain if they are perhaps threatened by a adversary, particularly a foreign adversary. And so the example, once again, in the terrestrial mindset, a great example of expansion would be the British, once again with Captain Cook. So he went and explored. He brought back all sorts of charts of all the islands. And I believe it was within 25 years or something like that of him getting back to England and giving the military, here's the charts. The British had secured, I think, 7 key islands in the Pacific because they now knew where the key ports were. So in the naval domain, expansion looks a lot like ports. You can't really build road on the ocean. You can lay wires or cable, of course, that helps. But primarily it looks like ports, places to be able to pull into, refurbish your seagoing vessels, take on new trade goods, refuel, rearm, and move more easily. It's much easier to be able to refuel your vessels if you have a port, for instance, in Gibraltar at the South Africa, rather than having to make the entire circumnavigation with only basically taking a roll of the dice and seeing what you can try to guess to see if you have the supplies that you're going to need. Another example of expansion rather would be the laying of the railways through the Midwest is in the American expansion across. Obviously, it took a trip that was, when you were making it in covered wagon, I mean, months to be able to get from the Midwest to get further into the Midwest or even to the West Coast. I mean, it was months, a year. You could make that trip with the train. I mean, that was a huge expansion. You could make that trip in days. And so I mean, the increase in trade and all sorts of other things, the increased capability to have movements, there was significant benefit to the railway lines in the American Civil War, and a large amount of the campaigning was actually attempting to tear up hostile train tracks to prevent resupply. So important was expansion. How this probably will look in the space domain, like the sea domain, having a port on the other side to be able to refuel, refurbish is one key element of that. And China has already said they will have a lunar facility by 2036. The United States has said we will have ours somewhere between 2024, 2028. Addition to that, Japan has also stated they will have a moon base, and Russia has also stated they will have a moon base. Four major powers, all stating that they are expanding to the moon by 2036, I believe is the latest one I've heard. The other expansion is, it would be ridiculous to suggest that you travel to sea in a vessel, and then when you return to port, you chuck the vessel and have to build a whole new one every single time. Obviously, that's not economical. And so being able to have reusable rockets, continue to further reuse rockets in orbit. Expansion would also look like on-orbit refueling capabilities. That has already been tested and found to be that we can do that now. And so being able to refuel satellites, extend their life, that is another example of expansion. Being able to move into the domain more cheaply, and that lowers the entry cost, so to speak, into the domain, and that allows for the next phase, expansion, or exploitation rather, because now the economic case can close because your startup costs have come down. And also expansion is making sure that you know what's there and putting some sort of facilities in key locations. I mean, example, once again, British, Gibraltar, South Africa, key areas that allow them to refuel their own ships, and if there was national competition, perhaps deny those same capabilities to hostile forces. On the moon, the moon itself is roughly the size of the United States, give or take. However, the key locations, based on a lot of the studies I've read, is North and South Pole specifically is the most key for lunar ice, and also temperature, and also solar power. The peaks of eternal light allows for solar powering of any facilities you would have there. I can't hear you, by the way, Mike. Any solar powering of the facilities you would have there, which would also power a facility for distillation or anything else you would need to be doing with the ice to be able to break it into its components of oxygen and hydrogen, allowing for the construction of propellant, refueling of reusable rockets as they come back to Earth, or even taking that and then sending it back to the Earth's orbits from the moon, because the moon has 1/22nd the gravity of Earth. And so anything you get off of the moon is going to be much, much easier. That's why it took a Saturn V to get off of Earth. And it only took the small rocket on the lunar landers to be able to get back off the moon and back to Earth. Once you've completed expansion, you have reduced the costs and the risk of entering the domain and the key locations. The next step is exploitation. This is the touchstone of the entire theory, because ultimately astronautics drives space development theory. The whole goal of space development theory is to bolster national power through the economic exploitation of the domain. And that looks like resources. As I said earlier, I would argue probably one possible market there would be the rare earth metals that are fiercely competed for on Earth. There has been suggestions that helium-3 might be one as a possible power driver, as a utilization in fusion power. Other reports I've read, it suggests that that's maybe not, there's not sufficient hydrogen-3 to really be able to close on that case. There is a lot at Uranus, but that's obviously looking decades, if not probably centuries into the future, perhaps. But particularly the rare earth metals stand out, being able to refuel satellites using lunar ice. And then once you're on the moon, then anywhere else is also very, very easy to go. So for instance, you could expand to the moon with a lunar settlement, stand up a lunar propellant factory there, and then you get your rockets from Earth to the moon, refuel them there in orbit, or whatever the particular method would be you would use, or even taking the propellant from the moon back to the Earth orbit and just putting the rocket into orbit around Earth. At that point, you've refueled your rocket. Now you're topped off, you're good to go. And at that point, you can go to Mars or wherever else you want to go, now with a full fuel tank. And so exploitation is entirely economic. And so this is where the marketplace really takes over. And instead of the government having to pay for rockets, now the government has a biological marketplace that it can actually buy rockets from. It can put its missions on those other capabilities that are already launching, because there is a marketplace for them. In the European expansion, you had really two types of exploitation. You had the exploitation that the Spanish and French engaged in mostly, and that was the capturing of resources and attempting to bring them back to the old world, as it were, to Europe. But I would argue that was not a terribly efficient way to do it. Obviously, you lose a significant amount in transit, and that is now a strategic liability in that adversaries like the British can target those supply lines and capture those resources from you. The British, however, built new markets in the New World, and then most of that economic benefit was actually in the New World. It bolstered the home nation, of course, but that is ultimately where America came from, in large part, was these new markets that grew out to the point that it generated a sufficiently large market that it became a new nation. Exploitation, once again, that is the economic, deriving beneficial economic development from space. The tipping point is expansion is still pouring more money into space than we are getting out. Exploitation has been entered once, you have a net positive. So for instance, if you have $1 trillion market in space in rare earth metals and propellant and space station square footage to be able to do experiments or whatever you want to do, and all of this is generating more money than you are having to put in to maintain and continue to launch, you have entered the phase of exploitation. I would argue in low Earth orbit, we're probably already there. As we've already heard, beyond Earth orbit, I think that we are on the cusp of it. I think that it is that we can definitely be entering that in our lifetimes. But that is, in my opinion, that is the next big goal, is expanding to the moon to the point that the economic case can close and we can now enter exploitation on the moon as well. And then finally, I won't spend too much time on it, but exclusion. So intrinsic also to space development theory is the concept of initial positioning, I guess we'll call it. And that is, let's pretend we're at a party. I know we don't have a lot of those right now with COVID, but remember back when we would have parties and you'd have that one spot on the couch that's perfect. That's where you want to sit. Everyone wants to sit there. That is the key spot. Whoever sits down on that spot on the couch first has the occupational advantage. They own that terrain, to put it in strategic terms. They own the terrain, and if you can ask them, you can negotiate essentially, perhaps to share. You can engage in hostile actions. You can physically push them out of the spot. You can engage in alliance warfare. You can have someone call the person's name that's sitting down, and perhaps they get up and now you can come sit down. But you have to do something to be able to get them out of that place. They have the positional advantage. Anything you do, particularly a direct movement against them, is going to be considered aggressive. Whereas the person who sat down was just engaging in their free rights. There was no aggression there when they sat down. But if you push them out of that spot, you have engaged in aggression. And so this starts to get into deterrence calculation and the fact that the second actor has a additional cost to acting that the first one does not. And so as you expand, the reason you identify the strategic locations in exploration is that you should, of course, attempt to have some form of control or occupation of them under expansion. In exploitation, those should benefit you. They are either, like I said, South Pole, if it's Lagrange points, being able to position refueling ports there, whatever those strategic locations look like in the domain, and domain knowledge is key to knowing what those look like. And then in exclusion, you have those key locations. The purpose ultimately of exclusion is to be able to present the hostile adversary with such a negative situation and overwhelming forces able to be mustered across the full spectrum, dime, so diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, to present them with such a situation that you can deter them. It is better not even to attempt to engage in hostile action against you, because the outcome's already known. It's just going to be very costly for them in particular, and so they won't engage in it. And you can lower the benefit they can gain also by welcoming them into the system that you have helped stand up through the national capabilities that you should be developing, especially economic capabilities. One option that this could look like is, for instance, with the rare earth metals, instead of hoarding all of those to ourselves, perhaps we sell 20% of those on the world market or something like that. Depending on, maybe we give higher, in particular, the Artemis Accords, perhaps being part of the Artemis Accords, you get an additional 15% or whatever, however we would incentivize people to be a part of that particular system. And then, like I said, if there is a hostile force that is attempting to engage you, you must be able to muster sufficient military capability and also economic, diplomatic, informational, to be able to deny that adversary the capability of taking essentially what has been decided by as international law that is yours. I'll go to questions in just a moment, but to give one final example of what exclusion looks like, in, I believe, 2013, China declared that they would take the Hongyang Islands. These are also known as the Scarborough Shoals by the Philippines. And they went in, they with a combination of civilian and military efforts, they secured those islands. The Philippines were not able to exclude them, even though this was their traditional ownership and their traditional claim. They took it to the legal courts, the International Court of Arbitration, or International Court of Arbitration found, I believe, in 2015, that China was in abeyance of international law. They had no right to occupy those islands. However, China essentially said, that's very nice, that law does not hold here, and we are going to continue to maintain them. And they have now, because they took those islands over, they have now excluded those from the Philippines. And obviously that is part of their ongoing economic competition in the South China Sea. And so I'm assuming it would look fairly similar in space, like I said, with the Lagrange points, north and south pole of the moon, particularly important orbits. You can argue that the geo orbits in particular have significant usability. And all of this is ultimately having a big part of it is that initial occupational advantage. And a large part of that is having the infrastructure to be able to position there permanently. And with that, I will conclude if we have questions.
Josh, if you were asked for a soundbite for the ease, first give me the soundbite, and then give me a one sentence for each of them. I'm looking for a takeaway.
So to sum them all up, the first three are a natural progression. The fourth is conditional, and that can actually be dropped anywhere in the rest of the phasing, because you might be in the middle of expansion and the enemy attempts to compete with you. And so you must now shift to exclusion to be able to prevent them from occupying the air terrain that you have been working to expand to. Putting it in single sentence sound bites, I would say exploration is the first movement in the domain. It is seeking resources, positioning, and understanding of the domain to identify the most crucial locations for expansion. Expansion is moving into the domain with national infrastructure and capabilities, permanently positioning there, and lowering the cost and risk of movement in and through that area, domain, wherever. Exploitation is the goal of space development theory. This is, the core of it is economic. It is gaining sufficient economic benefit from this location that it is a net positive to the national capability, to the national budget, and the national economy, to hold that location and the resources or capabilities that location entails. And then exclusion is the conditional phase. This is only as there is a hostile actor or actors attempting to contest your locational advantage in some location that you are attempting to exploit, or in attempting to counter your supply lines to and from that location. And yeah,
we've been in quarantine and Zoom meetings for nearly a year now, and I still forget to turn on and off the mute button. Could you talk about your book, specifically the act of writing it, why you wrote it, under what circumstances, the background that initiated it? And I think you have arguably one of the most interesting titles of your master's degree. So share your master's degree title, because I think it's kind of pretty wild. And then talk about how you created this thing.
Yes. So the master's, the MMOAS, is the Masters of Military Operational Art and Science. Basically, it's looking at the military, but scoping out from the tactical fight and looking at the operational, and ultimately starting to look at the strategic. So not just how do you use bombers to achieve A, B, and C, but what is the purpose? What does this campaign look like for those bombers? What is the strategic goal you're attempting to achieve with those bombers, etc., as an example. So Space Power Ascendant, it's the book I wrote while I was at school. I was a part of the Space Horizons Research Task Force, and absolutely.
What's the Space Horizons Research Task Force?
Sorry. So at Air Command and Staff, Space Horizons Research Task Force is one of the class. It's a specialization, essentially. You can take up to three classes for additional credit. The Space Horizons Research Task Force takes all three of those and puts it in three semester or 3 quarters that you do this back to back. And so we studied a lot of the naval and air theory, so looking at theory itself. Then we spent an entire quarter looking at technology and locations and space now. And then we spent a quarter writing my thesis that I ended up scoping out to the book, and ended up writing it. As I was doing the study, 2 particular strands came together. The first one was looking at what became space development theory, looking at the phases of space development, looking at theories from air and naval, and finding commonality between that and space, and how that development would go about based on how those domains progressed. And then the other half was looking at China. In a lot of space literature, there's lots of concern about China, and they have an ASAT and they blew stuff up, 2007, and but there's not really, at least I'd never heard anything other than, well, there's ASATs, they can blow stuff up. I mean, and that's interesting, and that's definitely something to be concerned about, don't get me wrong, but that's not blowing up satellites is not a strategic goal. I assume, at least, and I assumed going into it, China is strategic. They're not just going to blow up satellites. That doesn't win anything. It's a technique, it's a strategy, but that's not a strategic goal. And so I had a chance to work with Dr. Namrata Goswami, brilliant scholar who spent, I believe it was a year and a half or 2 years in China, talking to the heads of a lot of their organizations and spending time working with their space professionals. And then she came back and she has written several books on it, testified before Congress. I believe it was 2018 was her congressional testimony. And so I had the chance to meet and interview her for I think it was about 3 hours. One of the most amazing experiences of my life. But in particular, she laid out, here in the congressional testimony, she lays out what exactly China has said they are going to do. And I had never seen it. This is page 69 of the book, lays it all out. I had never seen it all laid out. And so I ended up putting it on a timeline. I put all of China's stuff they said they're going to do, and then I put all of America's stuff we've said we are going to do. Two things jump out at me at first. The first thing is that China's goes all the way out to 2050, and we've got stuff, I think 2028 thereabouts is the furthest out of anything American goes that is a stated national goal. So first off, China does a really good job of laying out national goals and things that they have claimed they are going to do. The second thing is looking at the purpose behind what they are doing. And almost, especially what's really stands out to me is China's claimed that they're going to put a lunar station they're going to put it on the moon by 2036. Having a permanent station on the moon in 2036, you gain all of those economic benefits. You have, in my opinion, at that point, that is an expansion, almost certainly at that point, to the moon. And you now have the capability to produce propellant, grow crops. You can have mining facilities. And if you have some form of 3D printing, you can have printing or industrial production capability, self-replicating on the moon. And so seeing all of this stuff for the first time, and like I said, all I'd heard about China is we need to go faster. China is a threat and ASATs. And looking at it, it's way beyond ASATs. They are attempting to go and economically expand to the moon, and ultimately, I believe, engage in exploitation. I haven't even touched on their space-based solar and all sorts of other things that will also likely be keys to their overall strategic goals. But now I believe with that, the strategic goals of China come into play, they come into view rather, in that they are attempting to utilize the economic capabilities of space to grow their own economic capabilities. And ultimately, once they're on the moon and able to exclude adversaries, it's very expensive to get to the moon. And according to treaty, you're not supposed to have militaries there anyway. So once they're in the locations, once again, positional advantage. I don't know how you would attempt to engage with them other than simply letting them have whatever locations they've done. If they've done what they're supposed to do and they have explored and they know where the most important locations are, they have already know where the most important locations are. They put infrastructure on them. And now they are in a very strong position to be able to exclude potential adversaries from those same locations. Unless you are willing to play in a Chinese-dominated space infrastructure, likely in the trillions of dollars here by mid-century, we ultimately need to beat them there. Okay. At least be able to contest them. And this is not talking about direct military conflict, to be very clear. I never recommend for direct military conflict in space. But I think competition and gaining that positional advantage is key.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Josh, for a really interesting conversation. We're going to pass it over to Katie for a moment.
Thanks, Josh. And is there anywhere that you'd like to direct people in case they want to hear more or learn more about you or learn about the things that you are speaking and writing about?
Yes. So I would recommend a couple of things real quick is go to spacepowerascendant.org. That's my website, and I pull all of the articles I write, and there's a link to the book on Amazon. Obviously, I recommend the book. It has gotten several 5-star reviews. I would guess say flattered. It's been very, very generous that they've given me so many 5-star reviews on Amazon. I was expecting at least 1 star by this point, but apparently not. And the final thing, so obviously it's not mine necessarily, but definitely the Space Force Journal is that we're having our inaugural quarterly issue by the end of this month. I believe we're coming out with it for Space Force's birthday, actually. And so the first Space Force birthday, we should have the inaugural issue of the Space Force Journal. It's going to be an online publication, and we have some amazing articles that we're looking at, that we have received, and we're in the process of getting ready for publication.
That's awesome. Thank you, Josh. Thank you for the presentation.